When I was about 12, my great uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of good stories, but this was the one that stood out the most to me. In the late 1960s, John was travelling by train from his village to another to visit a family. He had to change trains at one point and was dropped off at what amounted to be a platform that consisted of only a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing else at the station other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods. There was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter and getting colder and darker, and just around the time that he started to worry about a place to stay and food to eat, an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such a train, and when he was leaving, she said that it wouldn't be long until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night. She offered him a meal and a room at her home, which she said was about an hour's walk away from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less standard when travelling in this part of the USSR, and Great Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he gladly accepted her offer. He took his suitcase and they set off together down the road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2, and by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story home, John was tired and hungry. They went inside and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. This was the first time that John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realise that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to make a fuss, he quickly finished up his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing more. He thanked her. They said goodnight and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him alone in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called to her, but she didn't answer. He heard nothing else. Figuring that he would deal with it in the morning, and that she had probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down and laid on the bed. He then decided that he would make the best of a worse situation and tried to get some sleep. Before he could go to bed, he felt the urge to pee and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something that he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees and began to feel under the bed, into the darkness, thinking that's surely where the pot should be. Instead, while rummaging around, he found a body. That sounds like something that happened to me. Nope, Great Uncle John said, and went right to the window to see if he could find the exit to the room. There was a way out, but it was nailed shut. Definitely something that happened to me. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was probably a dead man, but if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman would come and kill him. So he did the only thing he could do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress. He covered it in the mattress and then hid under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps slowly coming up the stairs and then towards a room. The lock clicked and the knob slowly turned. In the gloom entered a person. They went towards the bed. Then he heard several terrifying and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which he then dropped onto the floor right in front of John. There was silence. Then the person went out of the room and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs. There was silence once more. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window. Now, he didn't tell me, but I can imagine he was terrified the whole time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out and then dove himself through, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind him. Luckily, he managed to land without too much injury. He began to run into a field behind the home towards a light in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transport trucks on it. John was able to catch a ride to another village, and he eventually got to the train. He never reported what happened. He just thanked God that he escaped and decided to travel with relatives next time. I grew up my entire childhood without a father. When I turned 15, I got really into hunting and enjoyed guns in general. My uncle is an avid hunter, gun builder, and ammunition reloader. He loves hunting. This was a common interest that made us become very close. He was my father figure and taught me a lot that made me the man that I am today. Now to the story. My uncle's father lives in Montana, which allowed us to get resident pricing on big game hunting targets. Once a year, we would head up to his property and hunt for a week. Usually, this would go off without a hitch, and if we were lucky, we would get the shot we were looking for. Unfortunately, not this year. Just like every year, we headed up to his father's property in northern Montana. That night, we headed out to get some hunting cameras, so that way we knew there was some deer in the area. So we knew it was a good place to hunt. It must have been 1 AM, and we were driving down this 2-lane dirt road heading into the woods. We were always the only people on the road, since it was so early in the morning. This particular time, we saw a headlight approaching from behind us, but we didn't really think much of it. It might have just been the first encounter we had that we actually noticed. Normally, we're in our own world up here. We figured that they must have been doing the same thing as us. After tailing us for some time, the headlights disappeared, which was strange since there were no turn-offs on this particular road. A few seconds go by. All of a sudden, we see the truck driving on the shoulder to our right with all the lights off. The shoulder was a small hill with brush and a fence fairly close to it. Definitely something that he should not have been driving on. The truck speeds up and gets back on the road, turns its lights back on and speeds off into the darkness. This set off some red flags. We figured that they were just impatient and wanted to get there before us. No big deal, or so we thought. We drove down the road some more until a few miles later we saw tail lights stopped in the middle of the road. It was a truck that passed us a few miles away. They had set up traffic cones to completely block the road off, and there was another truck parked on the hard shoulder. We figured that they must have broken down. We stopped. I read an article online earlier this year about people in the countries that would make these roadblocks to rob and kill people for their vehicles and belongings. I laughed and started to tell my uncle about this when 2 men from the truck jumped out. They began approaching us. My uncle always kept 2 handguns on holsters under his arms. This saved us. 2 of the men stayed at the tailgate of the truck parked on the road. The other 2 men come up to our window. At this point, my uncle has his right hand in his jacket while holding onto his gun. The men were extremely friendly and said that the truck on the shoulder has broken down and that they were just helping out. They said, did my uncle know anything about cars, and if he could quickly come and help. My uncle said no. This made the men very angry. Both immediately drew out pistols, and one of the men rounded the front of the truck towards my window. My uncle grabbed the man's gun that was pointed towards him, which he forgot to load a round into. Luckily for us. My uncle pulled his gun out and shot the man in the shoulder. He slammed onto the gas, driving on the left shoulder past all of the men. I then looked back, and I could see 3 other men gathering around the man that my uncle had shot. We drove, and drove for what felt like an eternity. We didn't even say another word to each other. When we finally made it back to his dad's house, he told me to go to bed. He called the police and told them what had happened. They dispatched 2 officers to the home to take his statement, and mentioned to him that they had quite a few reports of roadblocks being set up all around northern Montana. This happened to me when I was a young boy. I'm now in my late 50s, and haven't thought about being 10 years old in a long time. My youngest kid told me about this website a while back, so I thought you all might like to hear my story. I remember it being around my 10th birthday when everything in my life changed for my family. I remembered it being the best birthday yet because my mum had secretly saved up enough money for me to buy my own bicycle. I couldn't have been more thrilled. No more borrowing my older brother's bike or standing on the back of his. We were by no means well off when I was younger. We didn't have much, so getting a bike meant a lot to me. My father was a man who worked a lot and drank even more than he worked. I'm pretty sure he was drunk more than he was ever sober. Because of that, he was hardly ever around. That was okay with me, my siblings and mother for the most part. Things were actually nice and peaceful when he was not home. And the nights he did actually come home, we knew right away to steer well clear of him, be quiet, and leave him alone. We lived outside a small town, down a long dirt road with not very many neighbours nearby. The closest one was a good mile down from us. Now it was this really big farmhouse with a lot of fields around. I remembered being friends with their kids as they were around the same age as us and went to school together. Their mum was very sweet and always offered us something to eat or drink when we would stop down there. And their dad? Well, he was a complete opposite of my father. I never saw him drink, yell, or slap them or their mum around. We knew that not every family was like ours, and that some fathers out there actually seemed to care for them. Like I said, I remembered it being around my 10th birthday because my mum had baked a big cake for myself, my brother, and my 2 younger sisters to share, and of course she had mine too. Then, she took me up back where she had hidden the bike from me in one of the sheds. I remembered screaming with excitement, hugging and kissing her, telling her that I loved her and that she's the greatest mum ever. I hopped on it right away and took off up and down the road to test it out. It was a great feeling in that moment. When something so great happens, you kind of forget all the regular hell that life can give you. Things were good the next couple of days. My father had not been really home for almost a week at this point. Sometimes he would just stop in for a few moments here and there. I guess just to check up and make sure that my mum hadn't left him or anything. When I was that age, I hardly recall any point in time that he was home more than 2 nights in a row. We never knew what he was doing or what he was up to, We just knew that it was better at home without him there. I remembered riding my bike down the dirt road, on my way home from running into town to pick up something at the grocery store. Now that was for my mum, when my dad's truck passed me and kept on heading directly towards home. It made me not even want to go back home, but really, what else could I do? The sun had just started to go down, and normally if he did come home, it was right after work, or at the very least late in the night. It was kind of odd that he was on his way home. By the time that I pulled up to the yard, I could already hear the yelling. I could hear my mum's voice trying to reason with him for something, and I would hear my dad's voice just overpowering hers. I heard something smash. I didn't want to go inside. I could hear my sister bawling and then my mum crying too. My older brother just happened to be down at the neighbour's place that had the farmhouse. I really didn't want to go inside at this point. I heard another smash. I decided to go in because I couldn't leave my mum and sisters in there alone with him. I peeked in the window of the door before I actually walked in and saw the house getting destroyed right in front of my family by crazy drunk father. I tried opening the door slightly and getting my sister's attention to come out, but my dad had seen and went from focusing on them to me. I blocked a lot of this out, but from what I can remember, he turned straight and went to pick me up by my shoulders and started screaming in my face. My mum was behind him, begging him to put me down, but he just turned and slapped her. From what I could tell, he was livid from the fact that I was riding down the road without any of my siblings around me. When he got home, he confronted my mum. He got it out of her that she had secretly been stashing away money to save up for a bike. That's when he lost it. I'm sure he had drank pretty heavy that day. I remember the smell of his breath was like sour whiskey. He was sure that my mum was hiding other things from him and that he was going to find out. This is when he began tearing up all of the home. All the furniture was thrown around. Lamps and pictures had been smashed. He threw me against one of the walls and looked up from the floor. He had stormed into the kitchen and smashed what was left of my birthday cake. Both my sisters were crying and huddled in a corner. My mum had blood down her face. That was it for me. This was the worst I'd seen my father, and I was scared. I ran out of the home, hopped onto my bike and started heading towards the neighbours. We didn't have a telephone, but I knew all I had to do was go and call the police in town to stop him. I was hardly able to make it out of the driveway when I heard the front door open and heard my father yelling at me to get back there. I just kept on pedaling, thinking that I need to get to the neighbours. Everything will be okay if I can. That's when I heard his truck start up. I looked behind me. He was heading out of the driveway and straight towards me. I could see the neighbour's home in the distance. I moved onto the dirt path and kept on pedaling until I saw the headlights getting closer and closer. I looked behind me. He was just so close that I knew he was going to do some damage. I remember jumping off the bike towards the side of the road, tumbling into a field. I shot up and just stayed running across the fields towards my neighbours, hearing my dad yelling but not really caring. When I looked behind me, I saw my father had already turned around and was heading back towards the home. I think the most terrifying thing for me was being chased by my dad down that dirt path. I got to the neighbour's house a few minutes later. I pounded on the door. Their mum opened the door and took a step back because at this point, I was sobbing, shaking, and probably didn't look like my normal self. She took me inside and called her husband to get in there. I was in the middle of yelling, and my brother and my friend walked in from playing out the back, and in about 2 seconds, he was out the door heading towards home. The mum called the police in town and they said they'd dispatch someone immediately. About 10 minutes had passed and no police had shown up. I begged the husband to please drive me home. I didn't know what was happening. I was scared. He agreed since he knew that my little sisters and mum were there. About halfway down the road, we went past my bike. It was completely mangled up and a real mess. My dad ran it over with his truck on purpose. I began crying, partly because I love that bike, and mostly because I could have still been on it when he did that. When we got to the home, my father's truck was gone. Apparently, my brother ran all the way home, got a baseball bat that was on the side of the home, and with no hesitation, walked into the living room and smashed my dad's kneecap. As he laid there screaming, my brother grabbed my sister and mother and ran off into the bedrooms. He was able to crawl out to his truck and drive away. The cop showed up a few minutes after the neighbour and I arrived and took down everything that happened. They found my father about an hour later. He was actually found inside a tavern. Said it wasn't very hard to find him since he was a known drunk in the area. They arrested him on the spot. The night after the police found my father, the neighbours invited us to stay with them for however long we needed. We only stayed a couple of days, enough time for my mum to start making arrangements to leave that town and live with my auntie for a while, and they're about 100 miles away. I never did see my father again after that. I have never really minded that. I know he wasn't in jail for too long because shortly after we settled in at my aunt's, that's when the phone calls and letters started. But my mum never cared. Who would? After a year or so, she managed to get a divorce. I never really paid much attention to that as I was still young and living in a different life than I had before. We stayed with my auntie for a couple of years until my mum could get another place. At this point, my brother was 16 or 17, so he could help bring in money too. Life was better after that. When I was about 13, I was waiting for the bus at the end of my driveway. I live in the country. It was fairly light outside. I had waited at the end of that driveway hundreds of times, ever since I was a young child. Many times, I even stood at the end of it by myself after my parents took off for work. That was not one of the days that I had to be home alone. My mother did stay inside as usual. She suffered from a usual bit of prescription drug problem, which oftentimes incapacitated her and left her unable to get up from the sofa. Today was one of them mornings. As I waited, a silver SUV pulled over to the side of the road, right in front of me. I stepped back a little, surprised, giving the vehicle some space to park beside the road. We lived in a very small rural community, so it was not uncommon for random neighbours to pull up that I didn't know. However, this was a car that I'd never seen before, and the people inside, I'd never seen them before either. Nevertheless, I shrugged it off and decided to see what they wanted. I had never been taught about stranger danger of any kind. We didn't learn about those things in the community back then. They rolled down the passenger side window and revealed that they're an elderly couple. They were both dressed well, somewhat friendly. The woman smiled at me, showing her teeth. "Are you from here?" the woman said. "We need some directions." Yeah, what are you looking for?" "Do you know where the store is?" the man said, before telling me that he's from the neighbouring town. I frowned. The feed store was a local place that farmers went, and everybody knew how to get there, even people from the neighbouring town. So it was a bit strange for somebody not to know where it was, but I assumed that they're old and forgetful. My grandma forgot those things very often, so it wasn't too strange. I gave them very thorough directions and assumed that they would drive away. They never did. "So it's that road there," the woman said, pointing to a nearby dirt road. I frowned. I had stated very specifically that the intersection was another mile up the road or so. I corrected her. The woman gave me a blank stare with wide eyes and shook her head. The man's eyes were staring, darting from her to me. He looked very uncomfortable. There were cars driving around. They didn't seem to like that. I was too young to realise I was making them nervous. I assumed they were just desperately looking for the feed store. "So that's the one," the woman said, pointing to a different nearby dirt road. I was annoyed. I've always been taught to be polite to old people, so I shook my head. Then, the woman did something that I found very strange. She started to open her car door, smiling wildly at me and reaching towards me. She didn't get out entirely, but she shot a glance at the red car that was passing by her. I took some steps backwards. "Why don't you just show us where it is?" she said to me, reaching in even closer than before. Suddenly, the front door of my home burst open. There's my mother, although she was certainly still higher and certainly not aware of her situation. I truly believe she had some kind of sixth sense to open that door, because the lady quickly closed her door and the old man floored it. They were gone. They did not go anywhere near the feed store. My mother then wandered outside in her fuzzy slippers. Who was that? I don't know. They wanted to go to the feed store. They're just old people. My mum looked uncomfortable, but she accepted my answer and went back inside, undoubtedly to get high again. I got on the bus and forgot about the weird couple for the day, and for the next week, because nothing was out of the ordinary. Then, the Sunday paper come in. My mother, high as usual, flipped through it in a very casual manner. Suddenly, her face became pale. At first, I thought she had an overdose, which I unfortunately seen before. I rushed to her to make sure she was okay. She hadn't OD'd though. Her eyes were wide, full of horror. All she did was point at the article. It actually didn't take up a big article. It actually took up a part in the newspaper, not bigger than a single obituary or wedding announcement. However, the content was life-changing. As I looked at the article, I saw 4 very small pictures. 2 were the old man and woman that I had seen a week prior. The other 2 were a small boy and girl about my age. I had hardly even thought about the encounter until that very moment. What I read, it terrified me. The couple had been caught in the neighbouring town, lying about their location, claiming that they were from a town slightly nicer than the one that the newspaper said they were found. I noticed that immediately. Then, the article went on to say that they had been keeping a young boy, 6 years old, in the basement. He was starved, abused. As if that wasn't bad enough, there was also a girl. She was 13, looked a lot like me. This really terrified me. The people had supposedly locked her in a closet and starved her. She astonishingly survived the attack, but She was in a terrible way after. I cannot imagine what that poor girl went through. I can't believe that I never joined her in that closet.
About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as Tumble Canyon. It's a kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates. Stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions and the like. The kind of stuff you hear about at any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spawned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on, the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the Kings of the Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also know that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so travelling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area, a few ritzy houses, surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture to the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off into other directions, but ultimately culminate, after a couple of miles or so, at the base of a steep hill, adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and we made our way out to the trailhead, around 1 AM by this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot while Jeff, the other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 minutes or so, before David decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way up to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed a faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because a trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it as a type of truck typically owned by backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonised anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next stop. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us it was probably nothing, perhaps a guy just off-roading, as he put it. So with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behalf of Dave towards the water tower and got his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on Finkley Canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for an hour, we finally made it out to the water tower, climbed to the hilltop, and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment, while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch, just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point it's around 3 AM. Dave decides he's got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late, seeing as all of us have classes in a few hours. Just as we're preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back on the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us slid off the slide off the hill into the brush, clinging to the plants and rocks. As the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After watching for nearly 10 minutes, while we was also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, maybe 50s, stepped out of the idling truck into the glow of the headlights, moseying around looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This part still chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together, watching in complete terror, another man wearing a long, dark parka emerged from the brush, right where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently he'd been out the entire time we'd been walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat there in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made it like hell back to the car, down the canyon and back to our campus, just in time for class.
This happened when I was about 18 years old. I was big into running back then, and lived in a town that was a suburb, but had long swaths of farmland. I preferred running on the dirt at the edges of these fields, because it was a lot easier on my legs than running long distances on concrete or asphalt. I usually train for half marathons. It's about 13.1 miles. It's fun for me. This particular day, I was planning to run an easy 6 miles. I told my mum about this. She suggested that I did a loop and met them at the dog park about 3 miles from my home as my halfway point. This is pre-cell phone era, but being careful, I made sure I took my walkie-talkie with me that my mum and dad used. Now, the walkie-talkie had a longer range than the ones my brothers used, but it would definitely not work 3 miles away, and I honestly have no idea what the exact range was. So I take off on my run. I'm planning to go on the sidewalk for a little bit until I get to the fields. I'm running in the dirt with the road ahead of me to the left. I have to run south and then turn right onto a slightly smaller, less travelled road to get to the dog park. As I'm running on the first dirt part, as my parents drive by and being dorks, they honk and wave and yell at me. I wave and then soon after make my turn onto the smaller road. This one is road, me on flat dirt, small drainage ditch, forever of lettuce field, then a wall that is a backyard of some houses. I start noticing how quiet this street is and how there's so little cars passing me upon this dirt road. I randomly start thinking to myself, if somebody tried to do something, I don't know where I could run. I'm so far away from everyone that I couldn't make it. Then I heard a car, but this one doesn't pass me like all the others do. I hear it slow down. Now it's behind me, just out of my peripheral vision. My senses go super alert. I immediately realise what a dumbass I was to pick this route because I'm stuck out here with no help. The car begins to speed up enough so that it's next to me. I glance over and see a man, middle-aged, white, dark hair, totally normal looking, but I get a chill down my spine immediately. He sort of leans into the passenger seat and says in a super sweet voice, "Hey, how you doing? You wanna ride?" I'm scared and I realise that this is not good. Admittedly, nothing has happened yet and he could be totally innocent just wanting to chat, but my intuition is in overdrive telling me that I'm not safe. I hop over the ditch at least thinking that it's going to make it harder for this car to follow me if I need to take across the field and try and make it across the homes. This annoys him. He guns it and gets closer and closer to the ditch in front of where I am, and then he says in a voice that I can only describe as bone-chillingly evil, "You should know. You shouldn't be here all alone. Something horrible could happen. No one would ever find you." He has put his car in park and is taking off the seatbelt when I remembered the walkie-talkie. The piece of crap is all static because I'm so far away. So I immediately turn down the volume and say loudly, "Hey Dad, yeah, I see your car. I'm over here by the red Buick. Yeah, that one. You see me?" And wave to no one. There was no car coming from the direction my parents were in when I started talking. But the grace of the universe at that exact moment let a car turn onto the road. The guy saw it, glared at me and sped off. I have never run so fast in my life. I was looking behind me every few seconds, thinking that he'd be waiting for me at every intersection I had to cross. I was shaking, I was so scared, but I was so relieved when I made it to the dog park. I told my parents everything, and my mum called the police. They took a statement from me, but said they couldn't do much because nothing had happened. I was really struggling to get a description out too because of how scared I was. I was terrified, and I know that I'd narrowly escaped something truly awful.
I met Jamie in middle school, and the two of us hit it off instantly. We both had similar interests, and I liked her fiery attitude a lot. About a year after we met, she moved from the East Coast to Las Vegas, but we stayed in touch, talking almost every day after school or during the summer. We were extremely close and shared almost everything with each other, even including secrets we shared with no one else. In short, we knew each other well. When we entered high school, our dating lives were no exception to this. We shared who we were crushing on, and cheered for each other, and consoled each other whenever we had a breakup. We even entertained the idea of dating one another because of how well we got along, but decided the long distance thing wouldn't work. One day, out of the blue, she mentioned Ryan. Jamie went to school with him. He was quiet, shy, calm, and very smart. She mentioned that they were dating, and I was a bit confused. She'd never spoke of him before. She hummed and ahed a bit when I asked for the details, but the general gist was that he had a crush on her for a long time, from afar, and finally worked up the courage to ask her out. She accepted, and I didn't think anything of it. After that, I was slowly introduced to Ryan. At first, he was added to our IM chats, which we used whenever it was too late to be on our phone, or when the batteries on our phones died. He didn't talk much, but he seemed fine when he did. He started to pop up more often, and I grew to generally like him. We would all sometimes three-way call each other, and he was added to a Google Doc of ours as an editor, where we would write collaborative fiction. That summer, 2009 I think, I saved up and visited Jamie in Vegas. It was an incredible trip, and I still remember it to this day. Pro tip, if you go to Vegas, make friends with someone who has a Nevada ID. At the time, Jamie and Ryan were taking a break from their relationship, but I still met him one day, and he seemed pretty normal. Tall, about 2 years older than she was and I was. We were about 14 or 15 at the time. Dark hair, dark eyes, tan skin. We talked briefly, though I don't remember about what. When I returned from Vegas, my contact with Jamie was warned. I figured it was because of going back to school and both of us starting college prep and different programs. Phone calls became less frequent, despite transitioning from house phones to our own cell phones. She stopped logging into her chat client. She just kind of went silent. I was concerned with my own activities and didn't want to press her while she was probably busy. Next spring, she called me late at night. Something had happened. Something with Ryan. She was crying and panicking and apologising. I couldn't understand her, and it took almost an hour for her to calm down. Eventually, after she stopped sobbing, she laid out everything from the beginning. She had started dating Ryan, which was probably about a year prior at that point, because he said so. He randomly approached her one day at school and said they were dating, despite them never having spoke before. Like I said, he seemed like a nice guy, and she figured it was just his way of getting over being shy because of asking her out, so she accepted. She also figured he had a crush on her for a while because of how much he seemed to know about her, despite having different circles of friends with no contact. Slowly he started to become controlling, particularly when it came to her contact with other people. He demanded to go with her whenever she went out with her friends, even if he hadn't been invited and didn't know the person who invited her. He butted in and became part of every conversation she had at school. He declared that they had met in the hall between every class, even if it meant she had to run across the school to avoid being tardy. As Ryan became more involved in her life, he started to focus on her interactions with me. He asked to be added to our chat sessions because he was afraid she was cheating on him with me. He knew we were close and had thought about dating before. He wanted to know what we were writing together, so he had her add him on our Google Doc, despite having no intention of contributing. And though she kept a secret at how much we talked on the phone, he requested to be added each time we did. Their break was really because she had told him I was going to visit her. He asked her to tell me to stay home, despite having planned to visit for months, and she refused. I ended up meeting him while I was there on accident, and she was legitimately scared he might have done something to me. After I went back home, he apologised and tried to make up for it. It was textbook abuse with the weird nature of their relationship. He would mistreat her and then act all sweet to her until she came back to him. He started pressing her to cut ties with me again, and started lying about hurtful things I had supposedly said to him or her. She didn't believe it, but he wore her down with persistence. He would check her phone and computer to see if she had messaged me. After a particularly bad fight, she snapped and said she was going to call me and tell me everything that was going on, and that she was going to leave him and move in with a family who still lived on the East Coast. He responded with shoving her into the floor and almost breaking her arm. He then stormed out and she cried, but she didn't follow through with her threat. He called the next day and apologised, saying he would let her call me Sunday of that week and would make up for what he did by taking her hiking in Red Rock Canyon on Saturday. She cautiously accepted and went out the rest of the week. Friday night, around 8 PM, Jamie gets a knock at the door. It's the police, and they want to speak with her and her mum. They come in and proceed to tell her that they'd gotten a tip from one of Ryan's friends that he was planning to hurt Jamie. They got a warrant and searched his room and car. They found a detailed suicide note about his plans to drive her out to Nevada desert and commit suicide with her by slashing their wrists so they could be together in the afterlife. If she didn't agree to do it, he would stab her to death. They also found several knives in his car. After the cops left, she called me immediately and spilled everything and apologised for keeping this all from me. She felt like she could handle it on her own and didn't want me to get involved. We ended up staying on the phone all night until both of us fell asleep. We started talking regularly again after that, but I've sadly fallen out of contact with her since then. I still check up on her on Facebook though. She's moved back to the East Coast and appears happy. As for Ryan, I believe he was admitted to a mental health facility and still lives there to this day. I'm not sure what charges were brought against him exactly, but he wasn't declared mentally fit for a trial, and Jamie still has a restraining order against him. It just freaks me out that something like that could have happened to someone I was so close to. I talked to this guy, met him in person, and yet he was probably already planning to kill my best friend at that point. I still get shivers when I think about him, or think about how Jamie sounded that night she found out, only hours before he planned to murder her. The police never revealed who had tipped off the cops about Jamie, but I can't even imagine what it would be like if they hadn't.
One day, when I was an elementary schooler, I think it was probably 3rd or 4th grade, I was awoken by my mum in a rush. She had overslept, since she always woke me up in the morning. This meant that I had to overslept, and now there was no way I was going to be ready for school early enough to make the bus. School started at 8 AM. My bus pickup was 7 AM, but it's already like 6:40 or something. I was still in pyjamas. I hadn't ate breakfast yet, so my mum decided that today we would just tell the bus driver to go on ahead and she would take me to school, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. So I'm sitting there at the dining room table eating breakfast. I'm still in pyjamas, and now it's about 6:50. We hear the bus pull up. It's about 10 minutes later than normal. My mum peeks her head out the door into the foggy morning and waves the bus on. She closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus doesn't go anywhere. There's a knock at the door. My mum opens it to find a man in a bus driver uniform. He then explains to my mum that he's a substitute driver because the regular driver called in sick. He says that he's a few minutes early since he wanted to get an early start on the route since he didn't know it well. My mum explains to him that she was going to take me to school because I woke up late. He was visibly upset and says that he can wait a couple of minutes since he's already running ahead. My mum insists that no, I won't be ready to go in a few minutes, and tells him to go on ahead. He seems angry about this, but turned around and got back in the bus and left. I returned to eating my breakfast. I still don't have my school clothes on at this point. At 7 AM sharp, another bus pulls up. My mum thinks it's weird. She goes outside to talk to them. She comes back inside looking terrified, but doesn't really say anything about it and tells me to finish getting ready. At the time, I didn't know what had happened, but my mum would end up telling me years later. When she went to the second bus, she found that it was being driven by my regular bus driver, full of kids on the usual route. My mum asked the driver about the substitute driver and him calling in sick. I've never called in sick. There's no substitute driver on my route, he says. The driver immediately called dispatch in panic and told my mum to go inside and call the police and report the incident. There was absolutely no other driver doing that route today. It meant that whoever this was has targeted me for kidnapping. I never heard anything about it again, not even if somebody else had ended up getting picked up by him or not, but the chances are, had I gotten onto that bus, I would have never made it to school, let alone home again.
When I was 11, my grandfather was telling me a ghost story one day when I had said, "There are no such thing as ghosts, Grandpa." "Are you sure about that, kiddo?" he had said, with a look of genuine excitement in his eyes. "Absolutely." "I am going to teach you a trick today, kiddo. Look," he said, while raising a finger in front of me. I kept looking at the finger in front of my nose, but I could not see anything else other than his hovering finger and his eager face waiting for me to say something. "I don't really see anything, Grandpa," I blurted out finally. "Obviously you cannot yet. While looking straight, look at the corner of your vision," he said. "How can I look at two places at once?" "Just look straight, kiddo, and try focusing on the left or right corner of your vision without looking at it." I tried doing that, but perhaps I had rolled my eyeballs to the left a bit, too much, at which Grandpa screamed, "No!" "Keep your eyes fixed on me. Then try focusing on what's at the left and right corners of your visual field. Don't move your eyeballs. Don't you see anything?" I tried doing what he said. I saw nothing. "I don't see anything, Grandpa," I said, and watched the excitement on the face of my grandfather drain away. With a disappointed sigh, he said, "Maybe you will, someday." I didn't tell anyone about this interaction. I'm glad he told me this, since this would end up saving me soon. My grandfather passed away when I turned 13. I wish I could tell you that my family was sad and everyone was devastated, but they were not. My grandfather was considered weird and creepy by everyone in our family. After Grandma passed away, he tried committing suicide by jumping off a building. That failed, but the damages to his brain were substantial, and he wasn't the same person after that. He would sit alone and talk about weird things at himself if he didn't find anyone else listening to his make-believe stories. He was an avid believer of ghosts and demons and believed he would never die. During the past year of his life, he would drink all day and deliberately urinate at different corners of his room walls, saying he was creating a demon trap. My mom had to clean all that up. As morbid as it sounds, he was a major burden to all of us during the final year of his life, and my parents were more or less relieved that he was gone. My grandfather's room was assigned to me, while my elder sister got to keep the room upstairs. I was initially ecstatic about this, This was the first time I would have a room all to myself. I started to regret it terribly from the very first night. That first night, all of a sudden, my bed had started shaking in the middle of the night. It was as if someone, or something, was deliberately pushing the bed. I was so afraid to get up. That's when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps near the wall. All my senses were heightened at that point. I felt as if I could hear someone breathing next to me. I had never been that afraid in my entire life. I felt frozen on the bed, unable to move my body. Sometimes a fear of the unknown is more preferable than facing a real concrete danger. I pretended to be asleep, hoping that whatever was in that room would leave me alone and go away. With my eyes shut, I curled up on the bed and tried not to scream. I thought that not opening my eyes would make it go away. That's when it happened. A set of cold hands grasped my legs firmly. I did what any 13-year-old would have done at this point. I screamed at the top of my voice. As I screamed, the grip caught tighter, till my mom rushed into my room, flinging the door open. She turned on the lights to see her 13-year-old son sweating profusely and scared shitless. There was no one else there. Whatever was present a minute ago had suddenly disappeared as soon as my mom came in. I told her it was a bad dream, and I would convince myself that it was, till the same thing happened on the next night. Keep in mind that I was only 13 years old at that time. The next night, when it happened, I did not scream. As soon as I heard the footsteps, I got out of the bed and ran towards the switch to turn on the lights. The room was empty, but it still felt occupied. I could still hear footsteps near the wall where my bed was located. The lights apparently didn't make it go away. That's when I noticed it. At the corner of my eye, I saw my grandfather sitting, smiling in the creepiest way possible, showing as many teeth as he can, smiling from ear to ear. I looked towards the corner directly, and there was suddenly nothing there. Again, I tried looking at it through the corner of my eyes, and there he was. He had the widest, toothy grin plastered across his pale face, and it seemed as if he was trying to reach for me from the corner of the room. I would never forget that creepy smile, and to this day, simply thinking about that gives me chills. It wasn't my grandfather. It couldn't be. To this day, I firmly believe that it wasn't. It was some otherworldly creature with my grandfather's face. It had crooked legs and thin hands, and its thin, pale body was filled with scars. The sight of it made me sick to my stomach. The thing tried to reach out to me, keeping his grin intact, but it couldn't move towards me. It was then that I realized that whatever that was couldn't move away from the walls of the room. I tried moving the bed, trying to bring it towards the center, but I couldn't. I was just 13 at the time, and all this had terrified me so much that I chose to keep the lights on and sit at the center of the room that night. I kept checking the corner of my vision, but it was soon gone, but I was too afraid to sleep that night. My mom found me sleeping at the center of the room, on the floor. That morning, after an awkward breakfast, I decided to move my bed to the center of the room where it couldn't reach me. Mornings seemed so much better than nights. That night it came again, like it did on all the subsequent nights after that, but I was safe and away from its reach. I slept with the lights on for a couple of days, but then I started turning that off. On some nights I would find excuses to sleep over at any of my friends' houses, which my parents were cool with, but that was rare, and probably twice a month. The rest of the days I would sleep at noon and pretend to be asleep at night, always vigilant of its presence. Every night it would make sounds, scratch the walls, and try reaching for me from the walls of the room. I was only safe because my bed was at the center. Had my crazy grandfather not taught me the corner vision trick, I would have never realized how to get away from it. Every night it came, like a recurrent dream I couldn't escape from. You might think that, after a while, I got used to it, but one can never get used to something like this. Each night the thing came back to haunt me. Each night felt like hell. The fact that my bed was at the center and I was sure it wouldn't be able to reach me was what helped me to endure all those years. This went on till I went to college in another state and had to move away. I wish I could tell you that all was in my head. This was just the overactive imagination of a 13-year-old and nothing more. No, it wasn't. You could choose to believe whatever you want, but I will tell you this. Last year, while I was away, my parents had decided it was time to renovate their own room after my dad's promotion. So, for a week, they decided to use my room downstairs and sleep there, till the renovation of their own room was complete. They managed to stay there for 3 days. They spent the 4th day packing their stuff and moved to a new place on the 5th.
This just happened last night. I don't know exactly what to make of it. I'm an 18-year-old dude who lives at home with his mom. It sounds lame, but I love living with my mom. We don't live in the home that I grew up in, but we're in the same neighborhood as my grandma's home, only a minute away from all my aunts and uncles and cousins. It's always a nice and happy area for me because it's where I grew up around. To say it plainly, I love this place and feel comfortable almost everywhere in the city. Nothing bad has ever happened to me or any of my family members while we've lived in this town. It's close to the Gulf of Mexico. It's full of chemical plants and thus workers from chemical plants and their families. Most people mind their own business and have a lot of respect for hard work and integrity. But there are sometimes crazies, I guess. There was a body found in a storage unit not terribly long ago. It turned out a woman was murdered by her husband. He didn't even get charged though, because he committed suicide or had passed away since. A man who used to work at the same power plant I work at now was arrested for killing a woman and driving away with his car. My point is that bad stuff goes on here, but most of the time it's okay. That's why I think this event is still a little shocking to me. It's a typical Thursday. I wake up at 7, went to work, get off at 4. I went home, did all the normal stuff I do, took a shower, played video games, smoked and ate dinner. Pretty good evening so far. My mum's friend April came over and stayed for a couple of hours. She lived a block away and walked, but didn't want to go alone in the dark. My mum told me at about 9 PM she was walking April back to her home and would only be a second. I said, alright, see you soon. They left. No more than a minute later, I thought I heard tapping on my window. It was so light and inconsistent that I didn't know if anyone was actually tapping on my window. I felt a little paranoid, so I turned on some music to distract myself. I turned it down a little a minute or two later when I thought I heard my back door open. It's very loud because 1, how old it is, and 2, how we always keep the spare key in the lock which jangles every time it's opened. I turned off my music and didn't make another noise for a minute. I don't hear anything. I know someone opened it. I know someone was inside my home. I could feel it, but I didn't hear footsteps or a voice or anything. It was silent. I was kind of scared, but I quickly told myself to grab a knife that I kept in my desk drawer. I did so, and felt a little dumb because I figured that I was just being paranoid. Better safe than sorry, I guess. Once again, it was silent. I thought that if I acted like I had the upper hand over him, he'd be intimidated or scared. I then stood up, moved forward slightly, go towards where the back door would be in view. I whistled. There was nothing. I edged forward again and whistled once more, thinking I was big and tough. I was about to round the corner, then I heard something that made my hair stand on end. I heard someone whistle back to me, clearly coming from my living room. I was terrified. I peeled around the corner, and there was no one there. The door was closed. The door was not locked, though. I don't know if I left it locked or unlocked. I truly can't remember. My mum came home a few minutes later. I didn't tell her because I didn't want to scare her. I have no way to make sense of this, and even reliving that moment really chills my bones.
Writing this from a hotel bar. Yes, I have had a drink or two, or three. I recently started working security at a mall. Yeah, I know, Paul Blart, blah blah blah. The job isn't really for me, as I am neither a wannabe cop, nor do I get off on powered trips. But I do enjoy some aspects of it. I like a lot of the people I work with, and I like being prepared for emergencies. I train like crazy in case there's a fire or bomb threat. I study main designs and evacuation plan, so that if something happens, I can get people out safely. The vast majority of the time, I work a fake job. I walk or drive around the site so that people can see that security is there. Most of my job is just security theater. Sometimes I stop people from breaking into your car or break up fights, and though you may think I'm extraneous most of the time, when push comes to shove, you'd rather someone be there than not. Friday night, they mentioned me by the food court. This is the prime location for kids. It's where most of them get picked up by their parents. It's where most of them strut and phone and make anyone over 20 cringe with their transparent ridiculousness. Last Friday, I am working my route and I see about 20 or so people moving as a group towards the exit. This is not a good sign. I follow them from behind and they surround a few kids sitting on a bench. Something is going down. I radio dispatch for backup and advice of the situation. I'm comparatively huge, so I can see over everyone's head. I can see an older guy, maybe 40, pointing semi-violently at some young kid, 15. The kid looks scared. The guy looks like crazy white trash. I'm moving through the crowd and get closer. If the guy puts his hand on the kid, I'll have to do something. Don't touch him, man. Don't do it. Just don't. I yell out something like, okay, everyone break it up. But the guy will not back the fuck up. He's a little guy, no bigger than a kid. He has something to prove, a Napoleon complex. I don't want to get into a fight here. I don't want to get sued. He pulls his arm back, and I know he's going to hit the kid. I used to work as a bouncer. I know how to control people like this. I grab him by the forearm as his hand is back. He struggles. I roll him in close, surrounding him and putting my arm around his chest from behind, and my head all the way on the side so he doesn't butt me, and I can stop him from doing so. My backup arrives and starts clearing the crowd back. He says the cops are coming, though I didn't hear him radio them. They are on site and use our radios. I'm still holding this guy. I can smell something on him. Not liquor, it smells almost like burning rubber. I'm 80% sure it's the smell of crack. The cops arrive, they take the guy, take my statement and talk to the kid. I wait with the kid until his mom comes to get him, and we talk. He thanks me, which is always nice, and he claims to have no idea who the guy was. He said the guy was saying something about, "Don't you touch my kid," but he has no idea what kid he's talking about. He never touched anyone. After his mom gets him, I stay late to write my stupid report. We have to write these asinine reports anytime anything remotely interesting happens. They claim they're legal documents, but I think that's probably bullshit. I finish up and head to my car. It's about 1:30 a.m. and the parking lot is pretty empty. As I get to my car, I see some headlights turn on from another car a few rows over. I didn't see anyone walking to their car, but I was tired, so maybe I just didn't pay close enough attention. As I leave, the lights seem to follow me. No matter what I do, they're still right behind me. It's a white car, maybe a Charger. I can't quite tell at the time. It definitely had the crossbeam front like the modern Dodges. I test if he's following me. I pull into a development, take a ridiculous route, and he's behind me the whole fucking time. Back onto the main road. I can't go back to my house now. I drive to the local police station. I know some cops there. I'll go in and say hi. When I pull into the parking lot, he keeps driving. I go home, fine, with no incident. Saturday, I go to work again. This time I'm working a bit earlier, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. I get done and go home without incident. Around 10 p.m. I head back out and I see a white Dodge sedan parked across the street from me. When I look over, they turn on the engine, the lights pop on, and it drives away. I get home 3 a.m. Sunday and find a dead squirrel on my front steps. I am a bit intoxicated at that point, so I go in and go to bed. Today, around 11 a.m., I check and the squirrel is gone. Around 12:30, I go out to drive to work. My car won't start. It won't even try to turn over. I have never had anything like this happen. I have no fucking clue what's going on. I try the key a bit. All the electrical shit works. Then I go to start and everything shuts off. I pop the hood and everything looks fine. I call my friend and he gives me a ride to work. I do my shift like normal and get off at 9 p.m. I take a cab home, get there around 9:20 p.m. and a lot is wrong. My car is gone. My front door is open. My dog is missing. And I see that fucking white car parked a few houses down. I have the cab drive me to the police station. I close the front door but didn't touch anything else. I already met with a detective. He said the guy I mentioned earlier is a possibility. They only held him for a few hours. Apparently, attempting to punch a kid isn't enough of a crime to keep you in custody. He might be after me. He said they'll find my report, check out my house, and check up on the guy. But there's no much they can really do right now. He said I shouldn't hold out much hope for my dog, and the car is a crapshoot. Most of the time they wind up ditches somewhere nearby, but he says it would be best if I stayed somewhere else for the night. I don't make a lot of money, and the closest hotel is Sheraton. This is costing me $150 at night, a little more for the internet access, because they're assholes. I can't afford to stay here long, maybe a day or two. I'll have to go home eventually. I won't lie, I'm a bit scared.
I was 16 at the time. I'm Mal. Anyway, my family and I went to go visit some relatives we had in a foreign country. I was born and raised in the USA, but we still often go back to visit relatives. My dad didn't want to keep paying for a hotel, so a few years back, we bought an apartment. This trip was our first time staying in the apartment. The way the apartment is set up is that there is a living room where the only entry is, and the only air-conditioned spot. My dad was still back in the US finishing up some business. He was going to meet us there sometime later, so it was my mum, my 3 brothers, and I. The landlord who gave my mum the key was sort of creepy from her description, but it didn't really alarm anyone at the time. Also important to the story, my mum had to meet the landlord alone since we were all taking care of things at my uncle's home. It's now been a few weeks, and my mum couldn't stand her room since there was no air conditioning. I don't blame her, so we all slept in the living room. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. That was until about 4 weeks into staying there. At around 2 AM, my mum was waking me up with her finger over her mouth basically saying to be quiet. She then pointed to the door and someone was jiggling with the doorknob. We had forgotten the lock, but thank God my older brother got into the habit of locking with chains. It should be noted that my brother was dead asleep in another room. I was now the eldest male. My mum was distraught and was trying to figure out what to do. I was still thankful that at least a chain was there, but I think the man on the other side noticed that. I see a face pressed up against the wall from the small gap, and I'm not joking, it's the landlord. After a good 10 minutes of trying desperately to get in, he gives up. Or so I thought. The next thing that I see is a coat hanger trying to open the chain lock. I finally decided to do something. I body checked the door, slamming it shut, locked the actual door, and yell in my foreign language for him to go away. I looked through the peephole, and the man seemed surprised to hear another man's voice. I guess he assumed since my mum was the only one who checked in, she was the only one living there. He scrambled down the stairs. All said and done, he was gone by 2:30 AM. I looked out of the window across the street at the landlord's home. He just stared at me, turned off the lights in his home. When we woke up, I told my brother. We called the police, but they said they didn't have any evidence, so it was our word against his. My mum wasn't sure it was the landlord, but I know it was. I seen him. My dad arrived 4 days later, and I told him the story. He met the landlord and agreed he was creepy. My dad believes me, but my mum doesn't. We left the apartment the day after my dad arrived. My husband grew up in Scotland, and his parents, Finno and Angus, still live there. On weekends, they stay at their spacious house in the Scottish Highlands, but during the work week, they stay at their tiny utilitarian row house in Aberdeen. The house is renovated from a former fishing cottage, in a long row of similar cottages that are sitting right on the North Sea. The neighbourhood is picturesque, to say the least, with cobblestone streets. My husband's parents are pretty relaxed about locking their doors at night. That is until the incident I'm about to relate. They were sound asleep in the small bedroom of the Aberdeen home, and my father-in-law suddenly became awake with the sick feeling of something being wrong. It was dark out. His eyes were still adjusting to the darkness. But he scanned the room as he detected a slight movement at the foot of his bed. By this time, my mother-in-law had awoken too, and gasped, and grabbed her husband's arm. His eyes had adjusted to the dark now, and he made out the unmistakable figure of a man in dark clothing, standing between the bed and the doorway. Angus is a former military man. He's seen his fair share of mayhem. He jumped out, fist ready to go, and yelled, "What are you doing in the home?" The intruder just looked at him, as if trying to make up his mind. He then said quietly, "Wrong house. Sorry," and walked out. Angus followed to make sure he left. The wife quickly called the police, but when they picked up the phone, it was dead. Angus went out to check. The phone lines had been cut. If my father-in-law hadn't awoken and interrupted their intruder, I would hate to think of what might have happened to them.
I have one cat. He's a big tubby, a 13-pounder, but not fat. Weight is like a large furry brick, fuzzy but built solid. Wade does what any ordinary house cat would do. He sleeps most of the daylight away. He plays with fake mice. He closes at one corner of the easy chair. He waves between my legs while I walk. To be brief, he's a fairly normal cat, aside from being of the larger size. I've had him almost 2 years, though I am not sure how old he is, and in all that time he's never set foot in my bedroom. You might say that's fair. Lots of folks don't like pets in their bed, but I am not the reason he won't go in there. The bedroom door is always open. He just refuses to go in, and if you carry him into the room, he will leave as soon as you put him down. I found out why he won't go in last night. So, I got home from work, put on the Netflix show I've been binging, and settled in for a good mind-numbing sitcom. Around 11 p.m., I noticed that I forgot to turn off the bathroom light after I got home and changed. Must have been too tired or too focused on the show to realize it, because you can see all the way down the hallway into the bathroom from the sofa. Now, I almost got up to go trudge down the hall and shut off the light, but what I saw in the bedroom stopped me dead in my tracks. Wade was in there, sitting by the desk near the far wall of the bedroom. Weird, so he looks black silhouetted against the bright white paint of the wall. What made it spooky was his eye shine. It was red. I mean red. Okay, it could be the warm light from my red lamp just making his eyes sort of appear red. I realized this, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I suddenly didn't want to get up from my spot. I tried calling him. He didn't budge. I tried using the voice I make when I'm about to serve his wet food. No response. I even grabbed his treats and tried shaking the bag of catnip in front of him. Did not move. He just gazed at me with his blank, unfocused stare from down the hallway, with his glowing red reflections in his eyes. I'm still shaking that bag of catnip like an idiot. That's when I felt Wade rub his body against my leg. The real Wade. Needless to say, I almost crapped myself. There's catnip everywhere. When I look back toward the room, whatever the hell I had just seen was gone, and Wade was sitting at my feet, with his hackles up and his ears back. Bedroom door has been shut for the first time since ever, all day today. Didn't sleep in there last night. While I'm writing this, with Wade in my lap, I can hear something in the bedroom, scratching at the door frame. I've been hearing it on and off all freaking day. I'm looking for a new apartment.
This happened to me back in 2007. I was 9 years old. My brother was 14. My mum had sent us out of home with about $30 to go to get a movie ticket and maybe get a bite afterwards. After watching the movie, it was getting pretty dark. I was ready to go home. But my brother wanted to go get something to eat first, and we agreed to walk to McDonald's, which was only a couple of blocks away from the movie theatre. On our way there, we stopped and got approached by a man. He approached with a friendly smile on his face. He was holding a child's hand. There didn't seem to be anything off about this man. He was average looking and seemed to be nothing more than a father having a day out with his kid. "Hey, do you think you could give my son and I a hand real quick? We need help getting a mattress onto the back of our truck. It's just up the road. Nah, sorry, we don't have any time, mate, my brother said. It was at this time that I noticed a little boy, about 8 years old. He was abnormally thin, had a blank expression on his face and clothes that were way too big for him. I turned my attention back to the man, who was now mumbling to my brother about how it's only going to be a second. My brother kindly declined again, being the helpful kid that I was. I joined the man and tried persuading my brother that we should help him out. I turned to my brother, who was now staring down at the little boy. My brother had a disturbed expression on his face as he looked down at that child. The child stared back blankly. I didn't understand why my brother had that look on his face. He grabbed my hand and said, "I think my mum's over there," pulled me away. We began walking away from the man. I didn't understand what was going on and why my brother had just lied about my mum being there. He didn't let go of my hand and practically dragged me until we were far enough distance away from the guy and his son. I looked back, and I could still see the man holding his son's hand. Only now, he wasn't smiling anymore. His face turned to that of fury. He yanked the little boy on the arm and they walked away. I pulled away from my brother's grasp and bombarded him with questions. He shushed me, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, dialed in a number, began pacing and nervously talking on the phone. I remembered the police showing up. My mum came soon after. She took me home, but my brother was left with the police. I asked my mother what was going on. She said that the police were questioning my brother because the man we had encountered was dangerous. That's all she told me. I went to bed. But the next morning, I had completely forgotten about the incident. I went on as normal. It wasn't until a few days ago that these memories flooded back into my mind. I decided to call my 23-year-old brother to get some answers. When I brought the ordeal back up to him, he finally gave me some information I wanted to know. And now, I know everything. I understand how terrifying our encounter with this guy truly was. My brother told me that while the man was constantly trying to convince us to come with him, he happened to look at the little boy. The little boy then looked at my brother with his eyes filled with terror and mouthed, "I'm not his son. Please help." Then, his expression went back to being completely blank, almost as though he never said anything at all. This is why he becomes so freaked out and snatched me away. When he called the police, they hurried down and he described the man the best he could. They couldn't do much with the little information that my brother provided, because we hadn't seen the car the man supposedly had. My brother then told me that, apparently, the guy went on to kidnap more people, and that boy was never heard of again. It terrifies me knowing how close I come to that being my reality. It was so lucky that my brother read the situation and saved both of us.
Every summer, my aunt, uncle, and younger cousin go on a vacation for about 5 days. In the more recent years, they have started asking me to house sit for them. They have a 2-story house in a nice neighborhood. It has 2 basements, a basement and a cellar though, so I guess you could say it's 4 levels altogether. I live there with their dog and cat, take care of the house and flowers, and pretty much relax. The first few days were awesome, just going on walks with Jewel, the dog, and laying around watching TV, maybe the occasional tanning session, with my best friend outside. I was making money too, how could I complain? Well, around day 3, my best friend Sam was spending the night. We were having some wine and watching a hilarious show. Around 11, we decided to go to sleep, as we were both pretty exhausted and she had to be up early. She took the guest room and I slept directly across the hall in my aunt and uncle's. We both left our doors open, so with the lights on, we could see one another. We put the lights out and Jewel and I lay down. Within 5 minutes, I hear Sam scream and bolt to turn on her light. I sit up. "What the hell?" "There's something scratching the wall," she yelled, backing out of the guest room into the hallway. Sam's super paranoid, so I wasn't too concerned with her reaction. It's not the first time she's sworn she heard something. "It's probably just Tinkerbell, the cat," I reassure her. "Well, can you just take a look?" So I walk into the room. Jewel follows me to the bed. I kneel down and looked under. There is absolutely no way a human could fit under this bed, but I have known the cat to hide under there from time to time. This time, though, there's nothing there but shoeboxes for storage. Look, it's nothing, not even the cat. "You're just hearing things. Again," I tell her. Sam knows she can be overly paranoid, so she kinda laughs and gets back into bed, not super concerned anymore. I was back to my room and I see the light turned off behind me. Before I can even get comfortable, Sam screams again and runs straight into my room yelling, "No, I'm not kidding. There's something in there. It's scratching the walls." This time, I got a little nervous. It's not like her to freak out that badly. She may say she hears something, but she doesn't generally run around yelling. I turn the hallway light on and walk into the guest room, flipping that switch up as well. I put on a hard face and pretend she's just being silly. I tell her to look under the bed and I'll lift it up, hoping that I maybe just didn't see the cat behind the boxes. I lift the bed and she sees nothing. No cat, just boxes. I look around the room a little. We didn't find anything. Now she refuses to go back to bed in here. Instead, she sleeps in my cousin's room down the hall. While I'm a little freaked out about how she is reacting, I climb back into bed, telling myself that it's nothing and she's only being like this because it's an unfamiliar place to her. Jill decides to join her in my cousin's room. So, I am alone, a little shaken up. I hold the covers over my head. I am exhausted. Just before I drift off, I think I hear the closet slide open. Like a child hearing a monster, I hold the covers tighter and wait to fall asleep. The next day, we barely discuss the happenings of the night. Sam goes home. I'm back to being myself. As the day gets later, my mind is slowly distracted away from even thinking about last night. The neighbors bring their dog over to play in the backyard with Jewel. We chat for a while. They take their dog back once it starts getting dark. I can tell Jewel is a little bummed to see her friend leave. Finally, it's dark. Jewel and I are all cozied up on the couch, watching TV again. The phone rings. I answer. "Hello?" "Hey, Alfalfa. It's Sandra from across the street. I just wanted to let you know that the garage door is open." "That's strange. I don't even have a car." "It definitely hadn't been opened this morning." "Weird." "Oh, all right. Well, thanks. I'll shut that," I reply. We hung up and I head outside in the dark to close the door. My mind is running through the day over and over, finding no answer to how and when it would have been opened. I don't question it too much though, trying not to scare myself. I go back inside, locking the door behind me. I go to the front and lock that door too. Then it's back to the same old, Jewel and I hanging on the couch. The doorbell rings. Now, who is at the door at 9:15 p.m.? I don't live in this neighborhood, and most of the neighbors are aware that my aunt and uncle are out of town, so I look out the peephole. A pizza delivery guy? He's standing there, look kinda nervous. I crack the door just enough to ask him what the deal is. I think maybe he got lost. Pizza for this address? He says, smiling. I'm sorry, but I didn't order a pizza. Kinda giving him a weird face. I can tell that makes him a little nervous, like maybe he's new to the job and worried he'll be in trouble for messing this up. A large cheese pizza? Did someone order it for you maybe? He says, clearly worried now. Not that I know of. Is it paid for? I asked. Well, no. Sorry, I'm new, I don't really know how to handle this situation. He replies. I smell the pizza and my stomach kinda grumbles a little bit. It's probably one of my cousin's friends, trying to prank her, but getting me instead. I feel sorry for the guy, so I dish out a few bucks and just let him off easy. He apologizes for the mix-up, adding, if you want to find out where the pizza came from, I don't have the number on me, but you can call the restaurant and ask to look it up for you. Alright, no problem. Have a nice night, I say as I shut the door. So I have the pizza, but I'm still really curious. I figure I'll just call the place and get the number so I can tell my cousin which of her friends was pranking her. The line's ringing and I am waiting anxiously, because the more I smell that sweet combination of cheese and sauce, the hungrier I'm getting. Mario's Pizzeria, how can I help you? I explain my situation to the guy on the phone, who happens to be the manager. Oh, no problem, ma'am. Let me just look that right up. I sit listening to him fumbling around, looking up the number. I hear an aha, as he finds it, then begins to recite the digits back to me. I feel my stomach tense as my appetite leaves me. My hands begin to shake and my eyes stink. The call came from inside the house.
So I'm a waitress at a pretty small village pub. It's really chill and we don't often get a lot of customers. I'm usually the only server or bartender. The only really busy day is Sunday around noon, so my boss stays to help me with the lunch rush. Last Sunday was pretty calm and manageable. I was taking care of customers in the main room and garden, while my boss was taking care of 2 large parties in a separate dining hall. Since this pub is in a very rural area, I know almost all of the customers in there. Now, there was one guy who really stood out, just because I've never seen him before. He was probably in his late 40s. He smelled terrible, had extremely greasy hair. He was just standing at a bar, drinking beer and talking to a man who is a regular and comes in every day. The weird guy was constantly staring at me with wide eyes, biting his nails, which was already creepy as hell. I overheard him say stuff like, "Wow, she's such a doll. I wish she could wear a skirt when she worked," to another customer. This made me feel very uncomfortable, but still, it happens all the time since I'm a 20-year-old, and most our men are 40 plus who come in here. About an hour later, my area was pretty empty, and the other creepy guy was left at the bar alone. He was staring at me, biting his nails. My boss was up at the other end of the bar with a customer who was paying a pretty large bill, and when the customer opened his wallet, you could see a bunch of hundreds in there. The guy mumbled something in my direction and said, "I'm sorry." What was that? He was waving me to get closer. "Hey, I have a great idea," he said. "Oh yeah? What's that?" He nodded towards the customer paying his bill and mumbled, "We could kill that guy, bury him in the woods, take his money, and run off together." I thought that was kind of odd and a joke, and I tried to laugh. His face didn't move though, he just stared intently. I just said, "Oh no, I don't think that's a good idea." He wasn't smiling or laughing, so I just noped the hell out of there. I worked in the back until he was gone. I'm used to creeps in here, but this was some next level stuff that's really scared me. I haven't seen him since, and I hope I don't see him again.
My name is Maria. I am a biology student from Ohio who's currently studying abroad in Australia. I work at a wildlife conservatory in New South Wales. It's mostly labor work. I clean the enclosures and give some of our smaller animals baths. I am also responsible for feeding Anita, our 16-foot saltwater crocodile. Twice a day, I bring dead chickens to her enclosure and toss them to her from the shore of her personal pond. It's dangerous work, but Anita doesn't frighten me anymore. I've learned to interpret her behavior, and I know how to react accordingly. I know when she's hungry, when she's feeling annoyed. I even know when she's feeling playful. Anita and I have a rapport, or at least, as much of a rapport as a tiny pink bag of meat can have with the largest carnivorous species of reptile on the planet. But the thing is, she started acting straight a few weeks ago. She would be slow in coming to her feeding, or she wouldn't come at all. I haven't been able to figure out her mood lately. I talked to the conservatory's veterinarians, but there was no sign of anything physically wrong with Anita. At first, I thought maybe there was an impending natural disaster, as animals are known to behave abnormally before an earthquake or storm, but that didn't hold up, since none of the other animals changed their behavior. Whatever was happening, it had to be confined to Anita's enclosure or Anita herself. We played around with the idea that maybe it was me. Maybe Anita was behaving strangely because she no longer wanted to interact with me specifically. So, for a week, we tried new feeders. 2 different people would take turns feeding her each day. It didn't work. Anita stopped eating altogether until I resumed feeding her. I have to admit, as much as I wanted to find out what was going on, a part of me was glad she still wanted to interact with me. I took it upon myself to do an inspection of Anita's enclosure. It took the better part of a day to search an area that large, but I found something. There was a patch of loose soil around a section of a perimeter fence, and a gap dug down from under the fence. Something dug its way into the enclosure. I don't know how we missed it for so long, but I brought the discovery to my boss, and the enclosure was searched again, this time by a team. Apart from the dug-out fence, they found no trace of an unknown animal inside Anita's enclosure. There were no footprints or droppings. It was assumed by most that Anita had eaten whatever was unfortunate enough to break into her home. I wasn't convinced though. Something caused the change in my friend's behavior, and I could tell the other conservatory employees were starting to lose interest. The vets assured them that Anita was healthy. I knew the conservatory wasn't going to invest much more time or resources into investigating Anita's problem, so I came up with a plan to do it myself. Night was the only time Anita wasn't observed, so I would stay with her one night and watch for trouble. Sneaking past the night guards and cameras would have been too difficult, so I opted to not leave at all. I parked in a different parking lot, so no one would notice my car still there after hours and when my shift ended. I hid in the locker room until I was certain all of my co-workers had gone home for the night. I didn't want to enter Anita's enclosure after dark, so I walked the perimeter fence from outside. It's never a good idea to enter the territory of a massive predator after dark, no matter what kind of rapport you have with them. I used night vision goggles to see into the enclosure. I found Anita on the back of her pond, looking eerie in the green light of the night vision. Her mouth was open and pointed toward the sky. It was a bizarre position for a crocodile to be, and I couldn't think of a reason for it. There were no clinging birds around to pick food, and leeches from between her teeth, and even if there were, there's no reason for her to tilt her head towards the sky. Then it happened. Anita's eyes convulsed, and she started making muffled barking noises. An arm reached out of her throat and grabbed the side of her snoot. It pulled the rest of itself out. It was humanoid shape, with a torso about the size of a toddler's and limbs that were too long in proportion to the rest of its body. I could not tell what color it was through the night vision, but it looked wetly like a newt, or maybe that was Anita's body fluids making it appear that way. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe until I saw that thing rear its head and look directly at me, like its eyes met mine through the goggles. I dropped the goggles and fled for the front gate, screaming all the way. I don't remember much of the next few hours. The security guard found me crying hysterically at the gate and brought me inside. He called the director, who came back to the facility and listened to me ramble about the thing I saw crawl from Anita's body. As you can probably guess, no one believed me. It looks like my days at the conservatory are almost over. I wasn't supposed to be there at night, and after my crazy story, it seems like most people think I was staying after to do drugs. They've suspended my duties, and I imagine I'll soon be on a plane back to the States. No word on whether or not this will affect my career. I want to say goodbye to Anita, but now, every time I walk by her enclosure, her eyes follow me, and I don't think it's my friends watching me.
This happened about 4 years back. I was about 14 years old and my parents were out and had left me and my sister alone, who were 10 at the time. It was about 10 or 11 PM when the lights go out. This used to happen sometimes in my country since it's a new country and really poor. But that time I noticed something out of the ordinary. Only the lights in our house were out. The neighbours were on. I had a bad feeling, so I quickly locked all the doors and closed the blinds. I then told my little sister to hide behind the couch and not get out whatever happened. I hid somewhere else with a knife. Tried calling my mum. She didn't pick up, so I waited. I thought it was over. I got out to my hiding place and head to the kitchen. I look out the window. Before I get close, the doorknob begins to turn. It doesn't work. So the other person on the other side tries it, violently. That's when I panicked and shouted, "Who are you? Get away, I called the police." I hear footsteps and then nothing. I went to the other room and looked out the window. I saw somebody running out of my backyard. My sister was crying, so I comforted her and stayed hidden until my parents arrived an hour later. We then told them everything, and my dad says whoever it was had intentionally cut out the house's electricity. To this day, every time the electric goes out, I get terrified.
I am 22, and this incident happened a year and a half ago. I had just moved into my first apartment and was in the process of moving in. The door that led into my apartment locks itself automatically when closed, so I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail. While talking on the phone with my boyfriend, I returned to my apartment and sat on the bed. While opening the mail, while using the phone, I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under my bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still, with his back towards me and his head to his chest, so I could not see his face, and he didn't see me. Trying to be rational, while so many thoughts rushed through my head, I picked up the phone, said, "Sorry, I dropped my phone. I'm just gonna take a shower and call you back. The bathroom is right by my bed, so I hastily walked in, quietly locked the door, turned the shower on, jumped out of my window and called the police. They told me not to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anyone comes out of the door of the apartment complex. This was during summer, and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car while watching my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my boyfriend and he came to me just before the police. I gave them my keys and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out, holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that had stood beside me and comforted me while the police searched through my house told me that the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives, waiting for me to come out. This man had somehow crept into my entry door while I was getting my mail and hid under the bed. The man that was trying to hurt me turned out to be a homeless person and was placed in a mental hospital. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day.
When I was a freshman in high school in 1997, my sister and I had bedrooms in our basement. Our parents got us our own phone line because they were sick of our friends calling and wanted us to keep away from their busy line. I was a night owl. I always stayed up really late. One night at around 2 AM, I finally had enough and hopped into bed to drift away when the phone rang. I knew my sister was asleep. I jumped out of bed and answered it. The person on the other line was horridly panicked. Please help me. My cat fell in your pool. Please. The voice was hazy and sounded somewhat female. I don't have a pool, I replied, feeling extremely confused. The voice turned deep, sinister, almost inhuman, and said, "Well, I don't have a cat." The line went dead. I was shaken. I was so terrified.